The Mexican Navy needed a scapegoat, and the only candidate on their list was this man, Juan Francisco Patron Sanchez, aka LH2. They knew where he was hiding, in a wealthy neighborhood in Nayarit, Mexico, and they had chosen to capture him in a swift midnight operation. But when he fought back, the Navy responded with a force so deadly it shocked the world. A chopper raining down bullets in a residential area? Who was LH2 really? And what exactly did he do to deserve this ruthlessly violent mode of execution? The rise and fall of the Beltran Leyva cartel. LH2's death was a message from Mexico to the US. At the time of his death, he was the boss of the Nayarit division of the Beltran Leyva cartel. But that cartel was a shadow of its former self. All of its founding members were either dead or in prison. To anyone watching, he wasn't nearly as powerful, influential, or brutal as any of his contemporaries. But that's to the casual observer. In reality, LH2 was probably one of the most powerful drug lords operating from Mexico, and his existence was so problematic that it bothered the US. So, the Mexican government decided to take him out themselves. But this raises more questions, because if you're like me, you're probably wondering what kind of power LH2 would have had, and why did it cause a rift between Mexico and the United States? To answer these questions, we need context. First, we need to understand how the Beltran Leyva cartel came to be, how it functioned, and how its mode of operation became the decision factor in LH2's violent demise. Sinaloa in the 1960s. It's the 1960s. El Chapo is a nobody in the drug trade, but luckily for him, he has the loyalty of 4 brothers. These are the Beltran Leyva brothers, founding members of the eponymous cartel: Arturo, Carlos, Alfredo, and Hector. By the early 2000s, they had built a formidable empire, and were expanding into the embattled Gulf cartel territory. A few more years down the line, they had started claiming territories north of the country, and to cement their presence, they formed a strong alliance with El Chapo's Sinaloa cartel. On one hand, the youngest of the brothers, Alfredo, married El Chapo's cousin, and in 2002, El Chapo tasked them with the security faction of the Sinaloa cartel, which they ran with ruthless efficiency. The brothers had become a national threat. However, the threat they posed was different from the Sinaloa cartel. They weren't just ruthless and violent, they were also calculating and strategic. The Beltran Leyva cartel, led by the eldest brother Arturo, relentlessly pursued the influence that money and intimidation could buy. It was exactly like the movies. Over time, Arturo had contacts everywhere, in the police, the military, the judiciary. He had even infiltrated the Interpol office in Mexico. So, this meant that every administration that tried to tackle the drug trade faced internal sabotage. Arturo was always several steps ahead of anyone who wanted to take down him, his brothers, or any cartel they were affiliated with. So, as you can imagine, the brothers became a priority for the Mexican government. The first brother to be taken out was Alfredo, the youngest. In January of 2008, he was arrested by the Mexican army at an airport under the most suspicious circumstances. Suspicious because Arturo hadn't gotten any intel of the hit on his younger brother. To make matters worse, a few months after Alfredo's capture, El Chapo's son Archivaldo was released from prison on what appeared to be a technicality. It was also common knowledge that El Chapo had grown to dislike Alfredo because of his flamboyant lifestyle. So, when he was captured, Arturo suspected El Chapo had sold out his younger brother. And when El Chapo's son was mysteriously released, his fears were confirmed. Convinced of the betrayal, Arturo waged a war on El Chapo and the Sinaloa cartel. Then, he kidnapped and executed El Chapo's son. But unknown to Arturo, another hit was in the works, and this time it was his neck on the line. The first opportunity to take Arturo came on the 11th of December 2009. The man was holding a Christmas party in a wealthy state in a town bordering Cuernavaca. Suddenly, the Mexican Navy surrounded him and tried to capture him, but they had made the error of underestimating the drug lord. Arturo fought them into a stalemate and was able to escape. The only saving grace the Mexican Navy had was their intelligence. Despite his escape, Arturo was now a big red dot on their radar that they traced 24/7. A week later, another opportunity came. Once again, Arturo was in another wealthy residence, and this time the Mexican Navy surrounded him like they were going to war. 200 Marines rappelled down 2 Navy Mi-17 helicopters, while 2 Army tanks strategically blocked major exits. Despite summoning the Armada, it took a 4-hour shootout before the Mexican forces could kill Arturo. Arturo's death was a devastating blow to the Beltran Leyva brothers, and it inevitably led to the cartel's demise. 2 weeks after Arturo's death, another brother, Carlos, was captured. In the years that followed, several key members of the leadership were either captured or killed, and finally, in 2014, the final brother, Hector Beltran Leyva, who everyone knew as LH, was also captured. A legacy of cartel brothers had come to an end. Their entire empire had splintered into cells and crumbled. And if it were any other cartel, this is where the story would end. But no, you need to remember what I said earlier. Drugs were not the primary trade of the Beltran Leyva cartel. Their primary trade was influence. influence. Corrupt individuals in the government were the cartel's main strength, and those corrupt individuals profited from the continued existence of the Beltran Leyva cartel. So, when LH's right-hand man, LH2, stepped up and took responsibility of what was left of the Beltran Leyva cartel, these corrupt government officials were more than happy to help. It stinks at the top. LH2 inherited all of his predecessors' contacts and influence. More specifically, he worked closely with a mysterious figure in the government known as El Padrino. This figure made him almost untouchable, as he continued the war against the Sinaloa cartel and attempted to rebuild the once great, now damaged Beltran Leyva cartel. But what LH2 didn't know was that the game had already changed in 2012. In 2012, Enrique Peña Nieto had just taken office as Mexico's president, and one of the first things he did was to draw up a list of 122 drug cartel leaders that needed to be captured. In the years that followed, LH was captured, El Chapo was hunted down mercilessly, and at least 100 other cartel leaders were either captured or killed. LH2 survived this period until a certain someone took America's seat of presidency and opened up a can of worms that shook the corridors of power in Mexico. The American government revealed that there were corrupt players in the Mexican government, and they were aiding the cartels in their path of destruction while undermining Mexico's efforts. One name that stood out was El Padrino, but no one knew the identity behind the name. But we know. El Padrino was none other than sitting Mexican Defense Secretary General Salvador Cienfuegos. Salvador had worked closely with Arturo and Hector before their respective death and capture, and now he was in bed with LH2. Salvador facilitated bribes for LH2. He helped to corrupt other officials, provided him with vital intel, included the location of his own men, and liaised with local police to torture and exterminate H2's enemies. Internationally, General Salvador also aided the movement of several cargo ships that were filled with thousands of kilos of heroin, cocaine, and meth that were then sold in the US, directly affecting the streets of Las Vegas, Ohio, Minnesota, and New York. Like I said before, the Americans knew that LH2 was being helped by El Padrino, but no one knew who El Padrino was at the time. All they knew was that it was someone high up in the Mexican government. So, in an effort to apply pressure on the Mexican government to fish out the mole in their midst, the American government publicly implied in 2017 that Mexico couldn't handle their cartel problem. They even suggested sending American troops to handle the cartels, which was nothing less than an insult. So, in response to the insult, the president of Mexico ordered the capture of LH2. These were the events that led to LH2's death. It was not some strategic attack on the drug trade, it was an issue of preserving the pride of the Mexican state, and that is why they could not afford to botch this operation. They had to prove to America that they could handle their own business. So, it's no surprise that in order to ensure that LH2 wouldn't escape, they used a level of force that they had not used before: the incredible killing of LH2. The operation was slated for the night of February 10th, 2017. They knew that LH2 was hiding in a home in an upper-middle-class neighborhood with 7 of his gunmen, so they came prepared. According to them, the original plan was to initiate a surrender. After surrounding the house with heavily armed vehicles and hundreds of Navy special forces, they began their advance. Big mistake. LH2 barricaded himself with his men on the top floor of the building and proceeded to respond with an ungodly amount of firepower. 2 of his men launched grenades and fired assault rifles from within the building, halting the ground forces' advance. Meanwhile, another 2 of his men manned the rooftop, firing heavy machine guns from the rooftops on anything that moved on the ground or in the sky. But the Mexican Navy weren't ready for some elongated firefight. They had orders to take him dead or alive, so they chose the former. They authorized and called in a Black Hawk helicopter with a mounted minigun capable of unleashing 3,000 to 6,000 high-caliber rounds per minute. It was a weapon used only in war zones, and yet it was now hovering over a residential building in a residential area in the middle of the night. I can't show you when the shooting begins, but just know everyone that needed to be dead died that night. The images of LH2's body that circulated the internet can be best described as a shredded version of his former self. The Mexican authorities defended the use of that level of force by stating it was a necessary use of dissuasive firepower that was needed to suppress outgoing gunfire from the structure. The arm of the Navy in charge of the operation tweeted out, "Today, in a confrontation between criminal and federal forces, Juan Francisco N. was killed with 7 other accomplices." The message from Mexico to Washington, D.C. was loud and clear. We can take care of our own business. We don't need your help. But there was unfinished business. The mysterious El Padrino was still active and very much alive. The aftermath. No one knew General Salvador's hidden identity from the time LH2 was captured in 2017 till he stepped down in 2020. General Salvador was awarded by both the US and Mexican government for his involvement in the fight against the drug trade. This facade collapsed when, after his retirement, the US arrested and incarcerated the general on money laundering charges.
The DEA arrested one of Mexico's top generals, Salvador Cienfuegos. Cienfuegos was arrested on drug trafficking and money laundering charges.
Investigations had revealed his identity identity. He was the mysterious El Padrino. However, as revealing and as shocking as this news was, by arresting the general, the US had broken diplomatic rules. This enraged the Mexican government. The president of Mexico, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, threatened to remove his support from the DEA officials in Mexico if the general wasn't released. A month later, the US caved. They dropped all charges and released the general on the condition that he would be prosecuted on his return to Mexico. The Mexicans never fulfilled that promise. All charges against the general were cleared. Evidence was leaked, controversial laws were passed, diplomatic tensions rose and dropped. And to this day, El Padrino, otherwise known as General Salvador Cienfuegos, walks the streets of Mexico, a free man.